right, Zeitgeist is a word that we take from German. Zeit means time, and Geist means spirit. And so spirit of the time is what's going on culturally and intellectually during a certain time period. For the last podcast of 2024, I wanted to take a shot at interpreting the spirit of the time for changemakers, what I'll call the Entrepreneurial Zeitgeist. What's potentially interesting or notable for innovators and entrepreneurs in late 2024. To help me, I've enrolled the help of two people I've learned a lot from, Rob Trice and Brett Wong. Rob's home base is in the Bay Area in California. Brett's is in Boston, Massachusetts. So we'll get a West Coast, East Coast, and no coast sort of perspective between the three of us, hopefully. Rob is a founder of Better Food Ventures in the Mixing Bowl. He has experience in mobile, internet, and telecom venture capital. And now he applies that to investing in technology that solves food and agricultural challenges. Brett Wong is a principal at Anterra Capital, a firm that invests in startups that leverage technology to build a safe, sustainable, and resilient food system. He comes from a family of agricultural entrepreneurs and has worked in a variety of capacities in agriculture and food before starting his investment career. Thank you guys for being here.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Yep.
So I thought I'd start out just by first asking what might be some key moments that help define 2024 for you. And maybe I'll have a brief one, having my professor hat on. And I might even zoom back a little bit. But in November 2021, so about 3 years ago now, I was asked to speak to a career seminar class for second-year students in the College of Agriculture here at Iowa State University. And the person teaching the class takes attendance using a program where you can ask a question. And so she asked me what question I would like to ask. And I said, ask this. At some point during my career, I think I will start a business or a farm. True or false? And so the results come in, and it ends up being 78% true. And so Amy, who was teaching the class, looks at me and she's like, Kevin, that seems high. What do you think? I'm like, that's really high. I used to ask that same question in my entrepreneurship class, and it would be 35% for students enrolled in an entrepreneurship class. But it's November 2021, and so it's like, well, post-pandemic, whatever, gig economy. But the next year, do the same thing. It goes down all the way to 75%. The next year, 75%. This year, November, about a month ago, 75%. And so, what exactly is going on? Well, who knows? But it seems like, at least among the next generation that I get the opportunity to hang out with here at Iowa State University, entrepreneurial intentionality at least is there. Whether those seeds bear fruit in the long term, I don't know. But that's continued to be a moment in November for the last 4 Novembers for me.
Can we unpack that one?
Give it a shot. What's going on?
So I think it's a leftover from COVID, right? Which is, are people actually running towards entrepreneurial opportunities? Or are they running away from a cubicle in an office and back to work, right? As opposed to work from home and that freedom, right? That's at least how I interpret it. I was going to tell you one of my 2024 is just going up to the city in the beginning of the year, and then also recently, and the city being San Francisco, and basically walking from the ferry terminal to Union Square, beginning of the year, almost every building had a for lease sign, and all the homeless and the doom cycle or what have you. All of that seemed very true. And my understanding is we have somewhere like 80 to 100,000 people less coming into San Francisco on a daily basis now than we did pre-COVID. But I look at it now, there's at least some life back in the city. And I think people do want that reconnection. So like, I'm just thinking about coming back, let's just say January and then also November, right? And how the city has come back to life. I don't think it's anywhere near where New York is, for instance, and we've got a huge hangover on our real estate. But I think that's really what's going on is it's not people running towards entrepreneurialism, but kind of running away from the corporate world.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting dynamic in this, in that young generations, and it's hard not to see the romantic aspect of being an entrepreneur, but the idea to disrupt is I think stemming from what you're talking about, Rob. Everybody had such a hard time during COVID, and so now, however you want to cut interpreting various data, it always comes down to this idea of like people kind of wanting to take more into their own control. I feel like is a bit of maybe what's driving some of this. And again, that romantic idea of being an entrepreneur who disrupts something in a major industry. Silicon Valley and the West Coast have painted a beautiful picture of how that can work really well. I think the rest of us have all seen how it cannot work so well, including the Silicon Valley. But at least it became romantic through the West Coast. Just sticking a little bit on your coast to coast thing here, Kevin. Um, but I believe that there's more of an entrepreneurial spirit in a lot of people now, at least in my interactions, because of the idea of not wanting to necessarily be behind a desk or be stuck in a place where you have no flexibility. And it's not just kind of where you work, or how you work, but also what you do. And everybody wanting to wear maybe a little bit more, have a little bit more versatility, wear a few more hats than kind of the corporate environment, I think like a lot of us are accustomed to in older generations. And for me, 2024, it's probably one I just want to forget. A lot of really great things have happened in 24. Again, sticking on your coast to coast idea, Kevin. I mean, we've definitely seen an improvement here in the Boston area, which is a biotech hub, much like San Francisco. But we've seen biotech starting to come back to life. Same right after COVID. There was so much capacity expansion in terms of lab space out here in Boston and in Boston proper. I mean, it was heartbreaking to see how many for lease or vacancies, despite like during the heyday, 2020, 2021 of no interest rates. There were signs all over those doors as they were being constructed, even though they weren't ready yet. And once they were ready, all those, company name signs had fallen away, right? So it's nice to kind of see the Boston biotech environment ecosystem coming back to life. And it's definitely accelerating. The challenge, and hence my comment about 2024, maybe forgetting in terms of what we do all day, which is think about how do we apply technologies into food and agriculture. Um, we haven't seen that recovery yet in ag. And so I'm living these two worlds where I live and the ecosystem at which I participate in, it's accelerating and getting more exciting. Yet then the area at which I'm hopeful gets better just on a personal level, but also professionally where we're applying and putting capital, it's just not there yet. So it's a little bit of a strange juxtaposition, I guess. And alternatively, as we think about the agriculture food space, that's been hard for 2024, right? I mean, farmers have really struggled this year, and unfortunately, I don't see how it gets any better really in 2025, especially with tariffs and a strong dollar. Um, so it's just been I think a hard year for the space that we are in.
Yeah, I don't know what the right analogy or metaphor might be, but is it what stage of hangover? It depends upon the cap table that you occupy. But a lot of money came to companies, and then for the next round or whatever, it's not there, and it just creates this reckoning that's really difficult. And yeah, how long does it take to work through? And and then when you have underlying currents, Brett, that you mentioned, commodity price cycles that are definitely not in our favor. It just takes billions of dollars out of the sort of income stream that flows from farms to agricultural businesses and everything in between.
Yeah, I mean, what I think will be interesting in a time series, Kevin, is you continuing to ask that question of your classes, of your seminars on an annual basis. And then, as this generation or this most recent one over the last few years kind of has tried to be entrepreneurs, um, and then I've gone through various phases of what that takes because, outside of farming, I think being an entrepreneur is probably the hardest thing anybody could endeavor at being. It's why I'm an investor, right? Because I don't actually have to take on the risk of what an entrepreneur has to do. I get to stand behind this fund that I get to support entrepreneurs in and be as entrepreneurial as I can without taking all that risk that entrepreneurs have to take. But it'll be interesting to see, in these challenged cycles, right? Like who persists and comes out the other end. So, this time series of asking this question over, call it a 10-year cycle, will be kind of interesting to see who keeps at it. That kind of shows you the serial entrepreneur behavioral, right?
In the last day of my entrepreneurship class, I always do what I call just an ask anything, like what have we not covered, whether it's about business, entrepreneurship, life, whatever. And anyway, one of the questions this semester, somebody raised their hand and they said, how many students from this class do you think have started something? Farm or business or whatever. And I said, I've made some estimates and I try to keep track of it. There's been, in the 15 years now I've been teaching the entrepreneurship course, about 1,700 students have went through it. And I think probably just around 500 are doing something. But I told them, Brett, to your point, I said, one of the delights of what I do is 10 years down the road or 5 years down the road, running into one of you who took the course and you give me the update and you telling me I'm doing it. And there's a smile on your face. And I said, but please know that smile on your face is not because it's easy.
Yeah.
And not because it's been successful beyond your wildest dreams most days and most years, but it's just sort of the fulfilling part of it. And literally the next day, and I sent this email to the class, I get a note from somebody that graduated in 2018, and she had a business plan in the class for a creamery, and it took her a little while, but a year and a half ago, she got the creamery going in very small town Iowa. It's not something Rob or Brett you would look at investing in, but she's making it happen and taking on a lease in a town of 350 people on Main Street where there's not much going on, but there's a little bit more going on now than what there was last year. And that's just really cool.
Yeah.
I was going to jump in on in terms of where we are, and I'm kind of going to step back a little bit. I don't think this is just agri-food tech, but just more generally. Maybe I still feel like we're very much in the kind of the throes of 2007, 2008, right? And in particular, you had a lot of people investing money based on the world that they wanted to see, not necessarily the world as it is. Mm-hmm. And you can look at a lot of our agri-food tech overfunded, flaming out startups and look at the underlying PowerPoint that they funded and the assumptions in there that were not grounded in reality. And, Brett, the term disruption was in there quite a bit. And then we had the reckoning, right, with 2008. I don't feel like we still had that reckoning. So I have a drinking buddy of mine is a high-powered Silicon Valley lawyer. And I talk to him occasionally, and I'm like, okay, what percentage of your portfolio companies have taken the medicine that they need to get to the right place? And by that, I mean a down round, the layoffs, recaps, a sale. And he said we're probably about half still. So we're still not there yet, right? And it's amazing to me when you look at the number of unicorns, how many were valued just at $1,000,000,001, right? So I would almost think that maybe they were just trying to achieve some sort of vanity metric and not really basing that on real numbers or comps or anything like that. So yeah. And then the other thing I was just going to say is, I had a portfolio company CEO, and he was speaking to a University of Washington MBA class. And one of the questions was, when should I start my startup? And this CEO said, when you absolutely, positively can't think about doing anything else. And it's exactly to your point, like this is hard, as you guys know, right? And we haven't even really talked about like the personal toll, the psychological toll, that it, the relationships. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's hard stuff. But it used to be, I mean, I came to Silicon Valley at the end of 2000, and what you would see is kind of the boom and bust cycle. And once the bust happened, that's where the real entrepreneurs were to kind of crawl out, and show their stuff. And I think because we had an era of free money for so long without a correction. So basically from 2008, until like last year, we had so many people step into this space. And whether that's on the investor side, whether that is on the entrepreneurial side, and we haven't worked through it yet. And because people raised so much money. So I'm still interested to see when the real entrepreneurs are going to step out. And clearly, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't real entrepreneurs, but the ones that have the metal, that have actually been around the block. The other thing I'll just say is, clearly in Silicon Valley, amongst the tech companies, it became cool to downsize, right? Elon, Twitter, then, you just saw that become the cool thing, just to shed cost at, Facebook, Meta, then Google. And so now you get all these business plans, Brett, I'm sure you're seeing them too, which is, hey, we're an ex-Google team. You should fund us just because we're an ex-Google team, right? We must be the smartest kids in the room. That does not necessarily correspond to having the guts to actually create a good startup company. And
yeah, at this point, did you? So you're one of the people that got laid off, huh?
Well, that's exactly right. And now I got to scramble and find a paycheck. So I'm going to go out and raise some money for my startup. I'm being a little snarky there. That's a little unfair because there are people that have done good things who are just, who have had that idea or been tinkering in the garage after hours. So, but I definitely, if I were to kind of map it and look at the number of entrepreneurs who have come from big companies,
the kind of waterfall and the ripple effect of like having a closed public market. The amount of bankers who have been associated with doing deals in our space now saying, well, I can do that.
right.
And you're like, well, really? Like, as a person who came from that world, it is a different world, right? And the idea that, now you can be an entrepreneur because, hey, you've seen how these deals get done. It's like, that's actually not even a smidgen of what goes into being a successful entrepreneur.
Right.
And more on the inspiration than discouragement size, moment for me in 2024 was SpaceX, speaking of Elon Musk, but SpaceX launching the rocket and catching it with giant chopsticks. And I don't particularly do social media, but when that happened, I started out my entrepreneurship class just by playing that 2.5-minute video of that happening. And it was interesting just to watch the entire class get still and just lock in on that stuff. And, as part of this podcast, I've done some historic work, and there's just certain periods of time, like when Henry Ford was starting his company and the Wright brothers were doing their stuff, where there was just, like these inspirational things going on. But you need, some of the entrepreneurs to kind of, to the points you've been making, not just to say they're going to disrupt, but to attack really significant problems and under the guise of reality.
I hate to do it, but I think that AI is going to, we've all done these cool things with AI where you're like, I can't believe, it's like bar tricks, right? Like I'm here with my parents for pre-holiday, and, just showing them what you can actually do with the AI, right? We all know it's overinvested and so forth, and we can talk specifically about the challenges in food and ag tech, but it is that moment where we're going to see some amazing things happen with AI.
And very rapidly, right? I think you're already seeing even even in the beginning of this year, I mean, where things have evolved on a broad number of different categories. It's pretty amazing how the LLMs are kind of changing the way we do normal life, right? Yeah, I think and it was good that you made the comment, Rob, as the West Coast guy versus me, because I was about to chime in and be like, well, Kevin, if we're going there, one of the things I think all of us can say just in our daily walks of life is like AI has changed for the better or for the worse, right? Like I still think, on my phone, AI has gotten overly complex. And when I want something simple, it's like trying to solve the world's problems for me. And it's like, no, I just need to know where to go. Like stop sending me in a different way. Um, but it has been a pretty miraculous evolution of technology in such a short period of time. And what is interesting there, and hence maybe back to my comment about being in Boston and watching the human biotech space pick back up, yet the agriculture or animal health biotech space not yet. Um, it's kind of in a similar vein on the AI side, right? Like, of course, that's a technology that will be applied across every walk of life, but being able to actually utilize it appropriately, monetize it, all of those things that at least us as investors are looking for, it's very nuanced in agri-food versus a generalist idea. And, sure, writing my emails for me and doing a pitch deck, which, yeah, I've never been good at a pitch deck, so it's really helpful, is wonderful. But like, how do you really help a farmer? I think we're still waiting to see how that works.
And I will say, even in farming, if you don't follow Bailey Stockdale from Leaf, he actually benchmarks the LLMs against a standard agronomist test, and they're rocking it. Like they can score quite well on an agronomist test, but that's in the classroom, right? So, and actually, I guess we should say things like, if you look at, some of the robotics stuff, it's pretty cool, and it's using AI. But Kevin's heard me say this before. The drum that I will pound again and again, particularly for agri-food tech, is we need to crawl before we walk, before we run. And before we can get the magic fairy dust of AI unleashed in this industry, we've got to go digitize our information. We have to put it into machine readable, interoperable data formats. And so much of the data that we have, I think it's Farm Progress says 2/3 of American farmers aren't using a software product.
Yeah.
And, we're looking at PDFs, we're looking at 3-ring binders, we're looking at the notebooks, and we got to put all that stuff behind us and start digitizing the information. Then we can go clean it up. And, the best farmers are out there, they're doing it. But the majority of the farmers still haven't. And it's not just necessarily farmers, it goes through the supply chain and it goes all the way out even to restaurants.
Yeah, I was going to say even the big corporates, who you would think are extremely sophisticated. You'd be surprised at how many things they send over in PDF. They're like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, we've got fully integrated data, and then they send you a whole file of PDFs, and you're like, that's not what that means, guys. Just being in one location is not integrated.
No.
Yeah, I mean, AI helping with autonomous farm equipment, I mean, some of that stuff has been really cool, but when it comes to human judgment and things, yeah. I did an experiment this semester, and so I've got in this entrepreneurship class that I already talked about, I have them create 2 ideas for startup businesses or farms. And so I have a rubric that I fill out and then I write feedback. And so I had a student build a GPT using my past data. And it's like, the idea is, can I scale myself a little bit better to provide feedback on their startup idea and more iterations? And it can imitate me pretty well. I mean, it's pretty freaky to punch in a 2-pager business idea and see it write back comments that write just like I do, but that's what it gets trained on. But I also learned it doesn't really have judgment and it doesn't identify and try to flesh out kind of those creative things that are at the heart of good ideas. Or as my student that worked on the project, he's like, I just don't think At GPT, Kevin has your emotion. And it's like, really? I suppose that's the case.
Yeah, and look, I think that goes across different sectors too, right? I mean, there's been some really interesting studies that have come out on the human health side in medicine that show LLMs performing better than physicians in a confined and limited environment. Um, where you put a bunch of very well-trained doctors, a very specific solution set with which has all of the variables included in it, and the LLM can diagnose better than the doctor can. But then you put it into to both of your points, the real world scenario. And Rob, you were talking about this, and Kevin, I think you were pointing a bit more about kind of the other factors that go into creating a good business and being a good entrepreneur. But you put those models into a real world medical diagnosis situation, and it does not perform well because it doesn't have the judgments. It doesn't incorporate the not integrated data that's not there yet. It only knows what it knows. And of course, they're going to get better, right? And we're going to feed them more data. And ultimately, yeah, there are things you can see that will become completely obsolete. But there's still absolutely the human factor that I think is an important piece, at least for the foreseeable future, before software eats the world, right?
Well,
And
sweet.
yeah, and I was just going to say on the other attributes, and back to kind of the aspects of an individual that really drive them to wanting to be an entrepreneur and take on such a hard task. Um, there has to be that drive and there has to be this kind of willingness and hunger to go do something different because it's lonely. It's very lonely, especially as the CEO of a business, where you're trying to create aspiration and vision for all of the people that you've brought on board with you and along that journey. Yet then you're answering to this board that largely is filled with investors who are constantly saying, well, you're not doing enough. And you're kind of sitting in this island that's like, oh boy, why'd I do this? And no software ever is going to kind of be able to create the attributes that get you through that.
Yeah, I was visiting with somebody who's scaling a company, and his revenue's into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So he's late stage and he's doing really well. And he had a board meeting coming up this week, and like they've had 25% EBITDA growth, and it's just like above board expectations. But he's like, I know I'll go into that meeting, it'll be like not enough. And anyway, I've been with him on part of this journey, and so it's like, your denominator is getting big. So 25% growth at this stage is pretty impressive. And he's like, yeah, but how do I get 25% the next year? Anyway,
Yeah.
loneliness of it's never quite enough. It's never fast enough. It's never big enough.
Yeah.
The treadmill that only gets faster and steeper. Well, what else, gentlemen, are you looking for in 2025? Just to bring a number to this, I looked this up in preparation, and this has gotten some publicity, but the Census Bureau tracks what they call high propensity business applications. So these are new corporations, and they have a way of distinguishing between those that have a higher chance of having employees and becoming employers. And so post-pandemic, that number just jumped. So I'll look down here at my sheet. 2010 to 19, the average monthly applications for these high propensity businesses was 100,083. But July 2020 to November 2024, it's averaged 143,675. And November last month was 157,678.
Well, that's okay though. So look, I'm gonna riff a little bit, okay, guys. We're clearly stuck. And I when we talked about highlights of 2024, I was gonna also tell you, I don't know if you know Dune Insights, but they do a number of kind of get-togethers. Brett, you should come out sometime. A guy named Howard Chow, who's a semi-retired lawyer, gets about, I don't know, 45 people or so together. and it's mostly investors, some entrepreneurs, and so forth. And we had one day on food tech, one day on ag tech, and the belly aching was real, right? About like it's the standard stuff you hear, like, well, is agri-food tech right for venture capital? And then those people that actually think maybe we can go change venture capital to adjust to our 2% of the venture market. But so I'm at the point where, like, okay, we don't have big exits. Over the last 10 years, according to Ag Thunder, we've invested $204 billion. What do we have to show for it? A lot of used equipment, CEA equipment on eBay, a lot of okay tasting alternative proteins. There's not a whole, faster meal delivery for sure, right? And so the model that we've got isn't working. And so we've got two groups. So we got Better Food Ventures that make the investments, the Mixing Bowl that connects IT, food, and ag innovators for thought and action leadership, where we definitely want to, back, Kevin, when you came to our conference out at Stanford a million years ago, we talked about seeing the issues, seeking solutions, solving problems, and scaling solutions. And my concern with this ecosystem is that 80% of our effort is still on seeing the issues and seeking solutions. 20% is really solving and scaling. Mm-hmm. How do we flip that? And, we have, I believe the number is 8,000 incubators, 7,000 incubators worldwide. We have 800 venture studios. We have at least 150 in agri-food tech globally. And we have this push model, right? Where incubator 6,999 goes and finds yet another soil sensor, thinks that this one is absolutely brand new, pushes that one out into the market, into the valley of death, right? And they join the other ones that have yet to scale. And a lot of these incubator people don't understand market or the peculiarities of the ag market in this particular case, right? So I'm looking at the 1968 classic Jerry Lewis movie, which was titled Raise the Bridge or Lower the River. How do we actually figure out a different way to do things? Because the market's just not ready yet for scaling in agri-food tech or for venture in agri-food tech.
Yeah.
So I see two things. One is pre-competitive collective impact. Because of the low margins in this industry, we need to go get the almond industry working together. We need to get more collaborative impact. And Kevin, respectfully, academia is not bringing those solutions. We give them a lot of money on the research side, but we're not actually seeing them get out into the field enough. Present company excluded, and a couple others, right? But just generally, the money goes on to the campus, and then there's some research and dust collected on a report. Trade groups, they're not delivering goods on the tech side, perhaps with the exception of folks like Western Growers. You're not seeing people stand up. I'm starting to see International Fresh Produce start to do some interesting things, but we need those folks to be more engaged. So first is pre-competitive collective impact, and the second one is the power of open source, which we just have not yet harnessed for agri-food tech challenges. So I'm looking at that as like, let's go squeeze those lemons, make some juice that will then be really good lemonade for the venture side in a couple of years when the markets return.
Well, Brett, I know don't have to go into your secret sauce, of course, but certainly your response has been really roll up your sleeves.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we've done at Anterra, which has been successful, and again, back on the 2024 aspect, I mean, collectively, we all have had and experienced these challenges. And Anterra, we have had some nice successes where we actually had a really positive exit on the animal health side in the summer of 2024. So things have actually been going pretty well for us as a fund. but there's a nuance to the way that we are doing things versus I think what others are doing. And for us, there's two key pieces that we focus on. One, it's kind of the managing of expectations, right? Which I think as an industry we need to do to a lot of what you're talking about, Rob. Um, yeah, I think the idea of knowing that we're going to have lower absolute value exits means that everybody just has to take it down a notch in terms of what on paper you're putting down. Because the paper doesn't ultimately matter. And what I at least try to articulate to entrepreneurs as many times as I can through our interactions is all you really care about in valuation is what dilution you have to take based off the amount of capital you think you're going to be raising. And so, yeah, if you are a business that's going to need a huge amount of capital, which ultimately then comes to question, is this really a venture play versus some other type of financing play? But if you think you're going to need a huge amount of capital, it's probably going to be a pretty big challenge if you still want to maintain a significant amount of ownership of your business and still exit it in the framework that our space has shown. Now, if you can be pretty savvy, and hence why everybody loves software or biotech or some of these things that can scale with less capital, and not to say that you can't waste a huge amount of money trying to scale these same exact things if you don't do it right, right? But there are means to doing these things efficiently. You can kind of build a path that allows a very consistent step up in valuation and thus kind of expected sense of dilution. And yeah, you're going to dilute yourself a bit more than you probably like to. The idea of like, oh, well, in great times, I can only take 10% dilution. Like that, I just don't think that that's probably a possibility for entrepreneurs in our space. Um, and that's on a per round basis, right? But like, the standard kind of 20% dilution, I think can be achievable and still get a good exit at the valuations we tend to see as really good exits in our space in that kind of 2 to 400 million. If you just kind of manage what that expectation is, and it really drives one important thing that's worked for us, which is alignment across the investors, across the board members, across management. And I think what we've seen, especially during this downturn over the last couple of years, there's no alignment in a lot of these companies. And we sit in some of the companies without any alignment, right? Everybody's in at a really differing cost basis. And that creates huge separation between the investors. And then when the investors are all seeing a different thing, they're not aligned with what the entrepreneur wants to do. And then, it just creates a lot of challenges in terms of if it's not going really well, then what's the next step forward? And so when you kind of manage the expectation for everybody, everyone's kind of a bit more along the ride in the same fashion of understanding what the outcome is going to be and what it takes to kind of get there. And sure, there's always going to be some deviation, but it seems to be a bit more concentrated and understood when it's a bit more managed. And by that, I mean muted expectations of being a unicorn or a decacorn or whatever. And then the other piece is, there's still so much risk in some of those later stage things you talked about, Rob, specifically scale up, right? I mean, we have been like everybody in this space. We have suffered from the unfortunate aspect of an early stage agriculture or food business not being able to scale and not having the right amount of capital to actually put the direct sales force or whatever business model you're using, but you always need money, you always need resources to actually get into the market. You're always competing against somebody who can bundle or somebody who's got big promotions or what have you. And so you're always challenged as that capital constrained business entity. And we as an organization, or as a sector, I should say, have all thrown a lot of money after ideas to commercialize businesses without a really great plan. And I think we're still trying to figure out what the right way to do that is. To your point, Rob, there has to be buy-in from the industry to allow that to happen. And we obviously have not seen that yet. And so there's a lot of gives and takes that have to happen on the commercial front. But for all of the risk that still sits there, specifically on the downstream side of taking these businesses to a place that you were just talking about, Kevin, where you're controlling your own fate, you're generating cash, or at least you're growing your profits 25% year over year. we try to take as much tech risk off the front end as we possibly can, because the idea of taking something extremely risky from the get-go and then trying to move through all of these different gates of risk just are stacked against you. And so those two pieces have worked pretty well for us in some of the endeavors that we've done at Anterra. The other piece is we're also been more willing to put more of the capital risk up. So put more capital, take that risk, and thus have more ownership. So for a fund, where we're managing multi-hundreds of millions, to get a couple exits in the couple $100 million, but own 50% of that business, the math can work, versus own 5% of a few of those, you'll just never return that capital.
Brett, I think the point that you made about the alignment of founders, new investors, old investors, ag smart investors, ag not so smart investors, and the team, right? And making sure that you can get that alignment. That is the point that is causing the constipation in this marketplace right now.
Yeah.
That is what we need to unwind to get things flowing again.
Yeah.
And that's where I think that we're gonna have more pain in the marketplace, because you can look at those companies and they just have not taken their medicine yet, right? To get that alignment and become healthy. And I'll just say, from a Better Food Venture perspective, when we started doing this, so we're digital monkeys, right? So we want to do exactly what Brett was talking about, which is, things that are not capital intensive. And we understood that there is a proven market for exits in agriculture and food in the, let's say, 250, $400 million range, right? And that was our plan, like get in these companies and then get them a nice, healthy exit in a relatively fast fashion. What we did not foresee was the era of free money. And, we got into a deal, for instance, with a Silicon Valley investor who threw 15 million into a round. We're like, all right, let's party. Nuh-uh. They had completely different expectations. And we had a nice, solid ag tech company with some big customers. They wanted this company to do a double backflip and show a completely different growth story that aligned more with their social media portfolio, right? And we're like, that's not going to happen. So that one didn't work out too well for us, right? So exactly that misalignment of expectations, you nailed it. Couldn't say it better.
Well, I wanted to wrap up today just talking, and I think we've already been touching on it, but talk about what are the most important things in the culture going forward. And Rob, in our email exchange leading up to this, you're like, agriculture or culture? Well, both. And that's one of the questions I like to ask audiences about this whole thing, is like, what is our culture in agriculture? And what's good about it and what's not? But, what are you guys looking for?
Yeah, I think, a little bit back on the last topic, we're still stuck in the middle of a group of individuals really wanting to push the envelope and change the way that this century-old industry has operated. And then you've got another set of individuals who are just heels dug deep, boots in the mud, saying, there's no way we're changing. And right now we're just so at odds with each other that you've unfortunately got a handful of folks wanting to combine those two groups, getting stuck in the middle and losing it all, right? So I think there has to be a bit of migration on both sides, on a cultural standpoint, of just accepting kind of what it is we're out to solve. And the archaic, long-standing organizations in this space need to appreciate and understand it needs to change the way they're doing things, because it's not sustainable on all fronts, right? Economically, environmentally, however you want to use the term sustainability. It's just we can't keep operating this way. And so they have to come a little bit more towards the middle. And I get that this is now starting to sound a little political, which is not the intention by any means. But the other piece to that is accepting that they do need new technologies, they do need new offerings, and they have to be willing to pay for them. I mean, one of the things we've struggled with so much, and I get we're in a down cycle and who knows how long this down cycle continues, but the unwillingness for the industry to pay, and that's across every part of this industry, is baffling, right? And the fact that we're talking about $200 to $400 million exits as really good exits, which sure, there's a playbook where you can make that work, like we were just talking about, but that's a pretty sad outcome. Hence why the generalists who do anything in this space say, what the heck? Like, this is a multi-trillion, we could all cut how many trillions of an industry this is. And you're talking about 400 million kind of peak exit value. Like that's just craziness. And that's again a good scenario. That's a great scenario. Forget good. That's a great scenario. So like the usual scenario is sub 100, which just doesn't work, right? And then there's the other piece on the other side of everybody, or the individuals who want to change. Obviously, disruption doesn't really work as we think about it in a Silicon Valley standpoint, right? Like it's go in and be an Uber. And it's like, well, you're never going to not trade with Cargill, right? Like that's always just going to be the case. You're never going to not get your seed from one of the seed companies, and et cetera. And so, John Deere will always provide you your machinery. Now you can get different nuanced machinery, et cetera, but you're still going to have to integrate with this industry. And I think that's where, and obviously Rob and I are a bit biased because our jobs are being specialists, but that's where you do need to understand the space at which you're applying the technology and how does it really fit in? How does it really scale? And, to what you just said, Rob, about Silicon Valley group coming in, their expectations were very different. And, there's so many people that are like, oh, yeah, just turn on the switch and then all of a sudden it works. It's like the farmer is a very different consumer, or the consumer and how they think about food is very different than just normal discretionary purchases. So I think there has to be this meeting in the middle. What I am excited about, though, and I'll stop talking, is I think we're starting to see the evolution of the entrepreneur that's started in the last couple years kind of get to a place where they've got more data, they've got more traction, they've kind of put some meat on the bones of their ideas from 2 or 3 years ago, and they're forged in capital efficiency, and they're all about kind of managing expectation and doing some of these things we've talked about today. And granted, yeah, if you looked at them last year, still too early. They still had to go prove some things out. But I'm excited for 25 as even here at the end of 24, you're starting to see some of them come asking and looking for capital. And you're starting to see those business plans and models really starting to build. And I'm excited about that versus having to continue to worry about these late things that are going up and down, and 50% of them, Rob, still needing to correct to even think about them. Like, let's start over and let's find some people who actually have a different mindset.
Well, I'll tell you that it's interesting. And again, Walt Duflock from Western Growers just put together a really powerful 12-slide deck. He's got posted on his LinkedIn about challenges in California agriculture. Exactly your point, Brett, about how we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot on top by mismanaging water, labor, so forth. Even like the regulatory side not supporting autonomous, right? And how we can lose a natural advantage that we have. And at the same time, you look at Peru stepping up. And I don't remember the growth rates, but like on the blueberry side and so forth, they just opened with Chinese assistance. They just opened a port down there, 25% of the size of the port of LA. So like when you look at the competition, it's not coming from somewhere in California. It's coming from Peru, right? That's what we've got to look at. It's not CEA or anything like that. So,
well, anything else to wrap up our discussion, guys? All good thoughts.
Yeah, I'm often asked, given now I've been doing something on the financing side within this space, I guess a little on the ops side early on, but it's 20 plus years now. I can sometimes come off a little skeptical, and people are like, why do you still do this? But in all truth, it's because I love this space, right? And Kevin, you mentioned it in kind of introducing me, but my family's been involved in this for forever. And the people who are making the world of agriculture and food go around are amazing people. And there's just so much opportunity to improve the way we do things. Like I'm in full fledged in continuing to try to improve our food and crop systems. But Yeah, I guess I'll leave it with that because I can sometimes come off a little skeptical, as you know, Kevin.
Brett, I feel exactly the same way. So I'm a relative newbie. I did, 15 years in mobile internet telecom investing, and then just about a decade ago, switched over to agri-food tech. I love this space. I love the challenges. They're not going away, right? And if anything, Kevin, you had asked kind of like, what are we focusing on? One thing that we ask ourselves when we look at a deal is something a painkiller or a vitamin, right? And so, for instance, I'm sorry if I'm picking on one particular company, but we just got a business plan a couple weeks ago for a company that wants to go disrupt the Pez candy dispenser market, and it was a better dispenser. It was functional candies. That's why. That's not why I'm on this planet, right? That's not why I. This is not how we're going to change the food system, right? But if we look at those pain points, whether there's the things that Walt identifies for California, or more generally, we need to solve them, right? The degree to which venture capital will be a solution or not, it won't be the entire solution. And I think that's where we've had to kind of right size expectations, but it's going to be a key element to solving this, right? And I do still worry about the number of investors who really understand this space and the amount of money that's going to be available for venture to support these kind of companies, particularly in the early and the mid stage, right? Crossing that valley of death, from seed to C, that's really going to be the challenge, I think. But like Brett, I don't want to sound too critical. I think I also am maybe a little bit too realistic at times, but it's not because it comes from passion. I want to make this work. I want to solve the problems, and I want to see people be successful at it.
Yeah.
So just yesterday, I was in the car with my wife, and it was a podcast with a non-agricultural guy, but he started to work on some agriculture projects and was providing some of his motivation for it. And it was a good critique of what he viewed as kind of weaknesses in getting food to his table ultimately, and how agriculture does that. And so Patty's question to me was like, you work in agriculture every day. Like, what do you think of this? What's it like for you to listen to this? And I said, I try to listen because he's a really smart guy. And yeah, he brings an outside perspective. But also what I've learned through this whole thing, and it's what you guys reflect, is that it's a very complex system of different people and organizations and systems and biologies and events and markets and just everything. And there are no solutions that are kind of end to end, at least very rarely. And
Yeah.
so you have to bring a deep and nuanced understanding, and some of the themes I think that you touched on today of collaboration and alignment. And that's what can we improve in the culture of agriculture? Certainly those are big things.
Yep.
Agreed.
Wait. We have one more important thing that we haven't talked about.
Please.
On culture, which in Brett, you mentioned it in passing, which is climate. Culture, yes, I know I said I was going to talk about Taylor Swift, but really, we have to talk about climate. It's going to be really interesting. I mean, this is going to become the painkiller, right? This is the thing that's going to be the drag on agriculture. And yet, we've got a new administration coming in who's not too keen on climate, probably going to cut funding for climate supported agriculture, climate smart agriculture. I don't know what's going to happen there. I mean, the reality of climate is kicking in. Climate change is kicking in. The funding is not there. And that creates yet another opportunity for others to step in and fill the void as we become less climate smart, if indeed that's the outcome. So I don't know what's going to happen. But we have to talk about it because it is the biggest disruptor for the next decade in food production.
Yeah, I mean, what's such an important piece on the food side, right, is that it needs the positive feedback loop, right? I mean, we can continue to have energy and ensure renewable energy is another story, but we can continue to rip things out of the earth regardless of how the earth is doing until there is no earth, right? We can't grow a crop or raise animals if there's no actual ecosystem to do that in. And so, it only gets harder as we treat the environment more harshly. And so it's one of those unique industries that does require that positive feedback loop. And, as an industry, I don't think any of us take it for granted, but unfortunately, I think the average consumer does. And obviously, to your point, administrations change and governments switch hands all the time, but there doesn't seem to be this burning understanding of how vital, getting control of that feedback loop is.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting on many fronts. I mean, on the sort of pessimistic side of the climate question, yeah, you can see dairies in West Texas that, I just don't think there's going to be water in 5 years.
Yeah, you just can't have a dairy.
Yeah. And it's hard to argue. Last year, at least in the Midwest, we got some relief from a rainfall perspective, but that's after 3 years of kind of wondering. And where do we grow crops and where do we raise livestock and what resources does it take? And California has struggled with water issues, some self-imposed, some other probably climate-related, Rob, but it's not the only place in the U.S. where we probably tend to take natural resources way too much for granted.
Absolutely.
Change.
We had one, the first that I can remember, and I grew up in Colorado, but have been in Massachusetts now for, call it 15 or so years. We had our first water moratorium last summer. And then we had a huge amount of forest fires this year because there was no moisture. This is the Northeast we're talking about. Like, this is Massachusetts, which everybody knows for just being bitterly cold and snowy and wet. It's changing. And look, we grow corn in Canada, I mean, none of us would have thought that was possible, call it 15 or 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, growing corn and soybeans way further north than, not that long ago. Well, any final thoughts for our audience, or where can they find or follow you two?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brett.
I'm just saying, I'm always excited and happy to talk about the space. And of course, always eager to meet more people in the space, especially entrepreneurs going out and trying to solve some of these challenges we've been talking about. And so, Anterra Capital, you can always find me or a colleague to speak to.
Yeah, and I tend to put a lot of thoughts on LinkedIn. That's kind of the platform of choice. The other stuff gets too noisy for me. Better Food Ventures and the Mixing Bowl. I should do a shout out. We do these landscapes at the Mixing Bowl. We just did one on crop robotics, for instance. We did another one on crop biologics. So where we'll throw them down, we'll do an analysis of how we're viewing the space, and they're for free. So take advantage of them, and hopefully I'll see you on the East Coast or the No Coast or the West Coast. So,
all right. Well, thanks for your time, and have great holidays and a happy New Year.
Happy holiday.
You too.